Thank you for joining us for this Canyon Professional Development session. The title of this session is Autism Spectrum Disorder Overview. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dyer, and I'm a full professor in the College of Education at Grand Canyon University. First, we'll start with our why, which is to empower, educate, and inspire our community so they take action to fulfill their purpose and to serve others. The objectives for this session are to understand autism and neurodiversity, also to define inclusion, and we will also look at ways to support students through academic, behavior, social, and communication supports. The exact cause of autism is unknown, although there are a variety of factors that can contribute. We know that it is a neurological disorder. We also know that there are genetic and environmental components, but there's no definitive information that's been agreed upon by the medical community. So, what is the definition of autism spectrum disorder, also referred to as ASD? It is a developmental disorder that impacts the way individuals communicate and interpret their environment, often resulting in challenges with social interactions and processing information. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, there are specific criteria for autism spectrum disorder. First, we look for persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions across contexts. Second, we will see restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. This could also be stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. There may be an insistence on sameness with an inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns or verbal or nonverbal behaviors. We may also see highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, and either a hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interests. The third component is symptoms must be present in early childhood, typically before the age of 3. And fourth, symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. There are specific characteristics that may be displayed for an individual with ASD. As I mentioned, symptoms displayed are usually during the first 2 to 3 years of life. These things that we may see at an early age may include a lack of social interaction, definitely a lack of or no speech development, lack of eye contact, little interest in people around them. We may see repetitive activities, and then we could see a combination of any of these characteristics as well. You can scan this QR code to see the 3 functional levels of autism. There's a resource here you could scan and keep and save it for future reference. I also have it here on the next slide so we can look at it together. So the researchers have identified 3 levels of autism spectrum disorder. So we'll kind of break each one down. So keep in mind that overall, autism impacts a child's behavior, social skills, and their ability to communicate. So with level one, you'll see it's identified as requiring support. We'll see a difficulty in understanding and following social rules. They may seem uninterested in social interactions. They may also have problems with planning and organization at times. So these individuals will require some support to be successful, to be, especially in a school setting and also in society. Then we have level 2. Now you'll see here it says requiring substantial support. Their social interactions are limited to narrow special interests. They have difficulty with verbal and nonverbal communication, and they have frequent, restrictive, and or repetitive behaviors. Finally, you'll see level 3, they require very substantial support. They're going to have severe deficits with verbal and nonverbal communication. They may prefer solitary activities and narrowly focused and great distress when they're changing from one activity to another. So this can help you determine which level of support you would provide to a student based on these different characteristics you see with each level. So we've talked about some different pieces with the behaviors. There's different things that can overlap with the behaviors. So we have restrictive, or repetitive behaviors that we may see. Some individuals with ASD may have repetitive body movements, such as hand flapping or rocking, and may also need to be in constant movement. We may see behaviors that come as a result of being over or under stimulated. So we really want to make sure we understand each individual's specific sensory needs. So when you think about the school setting, take a second and brainstorm 5 examples of things that could be overwhelming for students with ASD within the school or even right within the classroom. I'm sure you will not have a hard time thinking of how many different things may impact an individual's senses and how that can be very overwhelming for individuals on the spectrum. Individuals with ASD have a tendency to ignore or overreact to different stimuli. It's important to understand their sensitivities to noises, lights, and textures to make sure that we provide an environment that they can be comfortable in. If they do seem overstimulated from some sensory input, such as being in a large crowd, we can provide a quieter place for them to de-stress and be less sensory impacted. Here you can use this QR code to view a video that's really helpful in kind of understanding what it feels like to be autistic and how your environment can impact you, especially with the different senses. So feel free to take a moment to scan this QR code and watch that video. Now we're going to talk about how we can support individuals with autism so that they can be included as much as possible. And we'll look at the different areas, which will be academics, behaviors, social, and communication. First, we'll start with academic supports. So we know that these are things that benefit all students, but we may want to be more intentional with how we do them with students with autism. So we want to make sure we use differentiated instruction, universal design for learning strategies, and also looking at task analysis. So differentiating instruction is where we look at how can we make sure we're meeting students right where they are. We know that no 2 students enter a classroom with identical abilities, experiences, and needs. We want to consider what their differences are, including their background knowledge, maybe their language proficiency, their readiness to learn, or a possible disability. We want to think about those differences and plan our instruction to meet all of their needs. Helping all students succeed in their learning environment can be an enormous challenge, and a lot of times we really need to be creative and think outside the box. So successful differentiated instruction means that we want to break down the 3 different areas of instruction, and that would be the content, the process, which is the techniques used to help make sense of the content, and the product, which is where we give them opportunities to demonstrate what they have learned. So we want to make sure we're considering how to differentiate in all 3 areas for every lesson that we teach. Task analysis is the process of breaking a skill into smaller, more manageable steps in order to teach that skill. As the smaller steps are mastered, the learner becomes increasingly independent in his or her ability to perform the larger skill. So let's take a look at the steps for task analysis. The first step would be to identify the target skill. What is it that we're trying to teach them? Then we want to look at any prerequisite skills. Is there anything that they need to know before we start teaching the target skill? Then we want to take a look at the skill and we want to break it down into small pieces. This is especially important for students with autism because sometimes it's hard for them to attend to a task or a lesson if it's too long. So we want to break it down into the smallest parts that we can. Then as you do that, it's really helpful if you have someone else help you to confirm that analysis. And sometimes that's hard to do yourself. So sometimes you can have someone else take a look at your task analysis and say, oh, you missed a step here, or maybe this can be broken down even further. But definitely make sure you review it before you start teaching. Then you think, how am I going to teach this skill or this content? You design your instruction, and then you begin implementing your plan as designed. So let's take a look at a task analysis example. This is one for a life skill, so you can use task analysis for any skill that you need to teach. It can be a life skill, it can also be an academic skill, and we will actually look at an example of both. So I'm going to read through the task analysis for how to set a table, and I want you to, as you listen, to think about, have I missed any steps? Could I look at this task analysis differently than maybe how you would do this in your own home? It's important to think about both of those factors. So go ahead and listen while I read through the steps. So for setting the table, I have step 1, put down the placemat. Step 2, place the large plate in the center of the placemat. Step 3, put the small plate in the upper left-hand side of the placemat. Step 4, put the butter knife on the right of the small plate. Step 5, put the napkin to the left of the largest plate. Step 6, put the knife and spoon to the right of the large plate. Step 7, put the fork to the left of the large plate on the napkin. Step 8, put the dessert spoon and fork horizontally at the top of the large plate. And step 9, put the glass to the upper right of the large plate near the tip of the knife. So as I read that task analysis, you may be thinking, I don't set the table that way. Even if you look at this picture, it's got a lot of extra utensils possibly. So we would definitely want to think about a prerequisite skill for this would be, do they know what each of those utensils are and what's different about them before we even begin teaching this skill? Let's also take a look at an example with an academic skill. So let's take a look at an example of how would we task analyze writing a complete sentence. So again, I'll read through the different steps and I want you to think about, would you teach it differently? Are there different steps that you would include? So step 1 for writing a complete sentence is think of an idea or topic you want to write about. Step 2, make sure your sentence includes both a subject and a verb. Step 3, use a capital letter in the first word of the sentence. Step 4, arrange the words in order so they make sense. Step 5, ask yourself whether the sentence makes a complete thought. Step 6, end the sentence with a period or other end punctuation. So again, you may think about, well, I would teach writing differently, and maybe you have different steps, but either way, you want to be able to break it down into those small pieces to teach one skill at a time. Now take a stab at thinking about how you could task analyze something yourself. So an example could be, how would you task analyze the skill of introducing yourself to a new person? So if you want, you could take a moment to pause this and write down the steps. If you wanted to teach a student how to do that, how to introduce themselves to someone new, what are the different steps that you would take in teaching that? Next, we're going to take a look at behavior supports. With that, we want to consider the environment, social skills, especially with individuals with autism struggle with social skills. We want to look at different ways to support them. And we also want to look at self-management. So thinking about the environment, we talked about this a little bit before. There's so many things in the environment that might be a little too much sensory-wise for individuals with autism. That can be things such as lights, different sounds, maybe even other people. So some things we want to think about are, how do we physically arrange the classroom? Do we have things accessible for them? Do we consider if they prefer to be seated close to someone, or maybe they like to have a little separation or a little space? Are they seated to things that make noise, like the air conditioner or the door? Just thinking about where they can be most successful in your classroom. And then another thing we want to think about with the environment is time. We tend to be always running out of time in the classroom because we're trying to get so many things done. That can really increase the stress level for all students, but specifically with individuals with autism. So we want to think about priming them, making sure we give them time for transition from between different activities or even different places within the school to make sure that they're set up for success and not going to be stressed out with regards to time. With behavior supports, we always want to think about being proactive versus reactive. We know that we will get to know our students really well and get to know their individual needs. So we always want to be watching and listening for any signs where they might start developing some stress or anxiety that could lead to a behavior. We want to use strategies to be proactive as much as possible, because we know that's more effective and also usually takes a lot less time from instruction than when we have to be reactive. So we always want to be watching and listening and supporting proactively. As we look at behaviors and we're trying to decide how to address behaviors in the classroom, we want to definitely collect data regarding those behaviors. That will help us, especially if we're going to work with other professionals on brainstorming strategies. The more data we have, the more informed strategies we can develop. So when we look at data, we want to look at how often is the behavior happening? What is the setting of the behavior? Does it happen in all different types of classes, indoors, outdoors, or is it only specific places? If possible, we want to look at how long is the behavior. So we want to look at from start to finish. If the behavior is being out of their seat, how long is that happening? And then also, what can be really important is who is actually present during the behavior. So do we start to notice in our data, it's only when a certain teacher or paraprofessional or student tends to be part of the setting? Is that part of the behavior then that we could do something with, and again, be proactive? So really try to focus on, when you're making decisions regarding behavior, have some really good data to make those decisions with. We know that individuals with autism struggle with social skills, so how can we provide some supports with that? We can model appropriate social skills, also appropriate behaviors. And this means that you need to physically show them how to do it. So this may be a teacher and a teacher showing them, maybe a teacher and a paraprofessional, or even student and a student if they're able to do that. This will help them see, and they're going to be able to make that visual connection of what's expected of them, and they'll be able to practice it themselves. So after you kind of do some explicit instruction, also give them time to practice it in different settings so they can generalize that skill as well. With social supports, we want to make sure we are super consistent with them so they always know what to expect. We want to make sure we have a routine so they feel secure and safe in the classroom. That also includes structure within the schedule, within where everything's put in the classroom, within our routine. And we want to make sure everyone works together. So anyone that interacts with the student, especially students with autism, making sure they also pull in that consistency and that structure. We all have to be on the same page to be able to provide that. A really great strategy for helping to teach social skills are social stories, which you may have heard of. There's lots of them out there that are already created, which is really nice. You don't always have to go and create your own. So they are relatively short, straightforward descriptions of social situations. They're specifically detailing what an individual might expect from that situation and then what may be expected of him or her. So it's nice because usually we can have social stories for things such as what do we do when we take the bus to school? What do I do when I don't understand what someone's telling me? What do I do if I don't want to stand in line and wait for something? So I have a couple examples here. One says, you really want to play with your best friend Ben, but he's playing with Michael. Well, now what do we do? So you can find a social story for what they could do in that situation. Usually we have very minimal words in the social stories, and we rely more on pictures to show them what they could do. Another example is someone gives you an invitation to their birthday party, but you don't really know them. What would you do? And we'd walk them through some options of what they could do in that situation. So it's nice because they all tie to real world examples. So our goal with behaviors is we really want to guide students with how to manage their behaviors themselves eventually. We want them to become self-aware and responsible for their own behavior. So how could they do that? Well, we could help by helping them recognize the behavior, also helping them know what caused them to do that behavior so that in the next time they start to feel that way, they can also be proactive with that behavior instead of always relying on someone else to help them with that. They're also going to need support with communication. We know that's something pretty significant that individuals with autism struggle with. It's going to be very important that we model procedures and expectations, any directions that we're giving. We want to make sure we model all of those things. We also want to pre-teach new concepts and specifically vocabulary to students. So we can really provide a lot of support for them to be successful with new content if we pre-teach any of those things. Also, if at all possible, if there is going to be anything that's different in a student's routine or their structure of their day, if we know something's going to come up, we want to prime them or prepare them and talk to them about that. Say, I know our schedule after lunch is we usually go to this class, but today that teacher's not there, so we're actually going to go to a different class, making sure they're prepared before that actually happens so that, again, that would be proactive in addressing any possible behaviors. Also, another great communication support is anytime we have verbal instructions, if we provide a visual cue to go with that as well, that's going to be very helpful. That helps them make a connection. So always remember not to just give verbal instructions, but also provide a visual to go with it. And that's a really good example of that is when there are transitions from different activities or from different locations in the school, maybe having a schedule written out, but also for each piece of that schedule, including a visual to go with it. Now let's talk about inclusion and how it might impact individuals with disabilities, but also individuals with autism specifically. So inclusion means that all people, regardless of their abilities, disabilities, or healthcare needs, have the right to be respected and appreciated as a valuable member of their communities. So this definition talks about inclusion kind of within society as a whole. This next one is more specific to inclusion in the school setting. So inclusive education is when all students, regardless of any challenges they may have, are placed in age-appropriate general education classes that are in their own neighborhood schools to receive high-quality instruction, interventions, and supports that enable them to meet success in the core curriculum. And this really great quote that helps you understand even more inclusion for individuals with autism says, if you've met a child with autism, you've met a child with autism. Each and every one of them is so wonderfully different. So, as we wrap up this session, I would love you to think about 3 takeaways that you gained from this information, also 2 things that you just found interesting, and maybe 1 question that you still may have. And hopefully, you have some people that you work with that you can collaborate with and kind of reflect together on those things. So, thank you so much for joining this session today. Take care.